All right, there we go. Maybe next time. Rachel, how about you introduce yourself to everybody?
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Schuster. I am an addictions nurse and I am in long-term recovery from opioid use disorder. I am also a person who uses drugs, and I am really excited to be here today, particularly as someone who has felt like there was not a lot of support for someone like me when I was transitioning from an abstinence-based pathway. And so I'm looking forward to being alongside all of you today and my fellow panelists to talk about this because we matter too. Thanks.
Thanks, Rachel. And how about Nate?
Hi, everyone. My name is Nathan Smitty. My pronouns are he, him. I am the project manager for Harm Reduction College in San Diego. I'm also the executive director of Hope Shot Harm Reduction based out of San Diego, California. I'm in recovery from opioid use disorder, and I am a current person that is practicing drug use.
All right. And last but certainly not least, Ceci.
Hey all, Ceci, she, her. Feel weird describing myself this way, but I'm currently a law student as of like a month ago. I moved from New York City where I was for past 5 years, doing frontline harm reduction work, as a peer worker and then as a caseworker. And I also was the community organizer at Vocal New York for the Drug Users Union there, where I was building the grassroots base for our the legislative campaign to legalize overdose prevention centers statewide. And then I also recently authored a study with National Harm Reduction Coalition and Lighthouse Learning Collective. It's called Requeering Harm Reduction, so check it out. And the only way I found to describe where I'm at is I am taking a long-term break from fentanyl and crystal meth, and I cannot think in any other terms because I just can't say never again. But yeah, I'm so excited to be here.
Awesome. Thank you again, everybody. And Ceci, please drop the link to that report in the chat because I have had a chance to check it out and it's pretty bomb. So again, I'm really happy to see how much attention, this event caught, the amount of people that registered for it. It just, for me, really drove home that these are obviously conversations that need to start happening, because they're not. And, as Carla mentioned earlier, the Rethink Recovery Month campaign was, my brainchild. I had a moment a couple months ago. We were, on a call and, of course, Recovery Month came up and what events PAHRN was going to be tabling at and conferences. And I just, was thinking to myself, like, oh my God, I don't even care. Like, can we just bypass Recovery Month? And that stuck with me because I shouldn't feel like that. And really nobody should feel like that. Nobody should feel like they don't have a place where they belong, where they can be transparent and authentic and receive support. There shouldn't be all these silos and, you can go here, but you can't go here. And you can talk about this, but you can't talk about that. And, even beyond the issues that, we face with, not anything that's, deemed non-abstinence recovery, but also how often issues around race, gender, anything, any, social justice issues are so often deemed as an outside issue and not appropriate to talk about in recovery spaces. And that it's just not realistic, right? It's not realistic to tell people that they can't speak about aspects of their lives that are extremely relevant to, to their wellness, because at the end of the day, that's what recovery is. It's wellness. I have just in the last, I'd say probably year, felt comfortable and capable of being, open about being a disabled drug user. Part of that is having been able to build a really amazing network of people over the last few years. And also important part of that is being able to be employed and be transparent about who I am, and not only have that supported, but also valued for, you know, the unique experience that it brings. You know, and as somebody who works in peer support, that is a privilege that most peer workers do not have. I frequently hear, you know, peer programs and peer staff talk about the importance of, you know, supporting multiple pathways to recovery and meeting people where they're at. And, you know, if that is actually extended to, you know, the people they serve, it's not extended to the people who work for them. You know, so I'm fully aware of, you know, the privilege, you know, that I hold, and feel, you know, an obligation, you know, to talk about that because I can. And so just really happy to see so many faces. Um, and you know, let's dive right in. So I definitely want to start with, you know, I'd say probably at least the last 5 to 10 years, you know, such a debate around what is the definition of recovery? How are we defining recovery? So, you know, I think for, you know, each of you, like, what does that mean to you to be a person in recovery? And if you don't, you know, use that identifier, why not? And I mean, anybody, you know, feel free to kick us off. All right, I'm gonna pick on Rachel.
All right, perfect, because I was coming off mute anyhow, because awkward silences make me move. So I have been debating with this personally. I have, in my period of time of being in recovery, identified as such. But I am starting to see that shift of, well, there's a lot to unpack with that word. And oftentimes when people hear that, they automatically think abstinence-based pathway. And so then I will oftentimes get questions surrounding alcohol or whatever. And so I have really started to question whether or not that term really aligns with me. But at this point for me, I am leaning into owning that term with my definition to kind of reclaim it. So that's where I'm at. And I would love to hear other people's perspectives.
So, and I'll jump out once. So I mean, for me personally, it's like, you know, you're introduced to like the recovery atmosphere, you know, for me over a decade ago. And at that point in time, it did mean like a 12-step program and an abstinence model. But then over the course of, you know, going back to school and continuing my education, as a licensed social worker, my intent was to be a drug and alcohol counselor. So over the course of those 6 years in school, I took a lot of drug and alcohol classes and read a lot of white pages about, you know, abstinence model versus MAT versus, you know, moderation management, all of that stuff. And, you know, I started to develop this idea that it's like, okay, I do consider myself in recovery, although I did stop, you know, utilizing the abstinence model 3 years ago. And I am somebody that smokes weed and, you know, drinks. And at this point, I still very much consider myself in recovery for the mere fact that I'm constantly evolving and growing and changing, right? So while it might not be what other people consider in recovery in like that space, I still very much look at it as I'm going uphill and I'm not going downhill.
I just want to piggyback on what you were just talking about. I mean, the evolving and changing really resonated with me. I mean, I've never really like fretted too much over like the word I'm gonna use, or I still don't even really have a word that I use, and it's definitely not recovery. No shade to anyone, you know, who uses that, but it's just never fit. And I mean, for me, I mean, for one, I've been confused by the term in the sense of like, what even am I recovering from? Because like, there's a sure ton of stuff to be recovering from, but I don't even know if I would ever, if it wasn't a term, be talking about it as recovering from something specifically, because I also don't even know like what state I would be returning to, because I think recovery implies, I don't know, like that there's some state to which you can return to, because I don't think I've ever had some kind of state that I'd want to return to. And I mean, the harm reduction mantra of any positive change for me, I think is what I hold so close. And for me, the way I think about what I've been doing over like the past year, you know, because I realized I needed to take a break from really what I was like self-medicating a lot of trauma, and about like 6 months ago. And for me, I think my realization was, and maybe what some people would talk about starting recovery, for me, I think, and this might be a little waxing philosophical, but it's like starting to like change with change. And what that means is like things are always changing, like are never not changing. But I think when I was struggling the most, I just felt so stuck in like a set of patterns, and like, not adapting to what was going on around me, and all the different things that were changing. And I could just kind of burrowing deeper and deeper into this hole that I was in. And so I think for me, like it was like February of this past year, or of this year, where I had a bit of a moment. I mean, it really was when I got a new job. I don't know, it kind of, I don't know, lifted me up out of this hole. And so I could start moving again, with like the flow of life, because I do think for me, at least, like when I was in such a bad place, it was because I was really just like resisting change, and so for me, whatever recovery might be for some people, for me, I think I would at least talk about it as just, yeah, getting back to adapting and changing and moving with life.
Yeah, for sure.
I'll jump in. So I do identify as a person in recovery, right? Because and that just what feels good to me. I did practice abstinence-based recovery for 6 years, and then I didn't no more. And that didn't change who I was as a person. That didn't change like the growth, even though I believe that it did, because that's what was installed in me. That's what was pushed into me. That like, if I used anything ever again, that I'd be a bad person, that I'm going to die, that I'm an unhealthy person, that I'm not a productive member of society. And I'm just like, I had to get to the point that I felt good about who I was and the choices that I made, and realizing that recovery for me was about healing, happiness, and growth. And as long as I am doing that to the best of my ability and to my standards and no one else's, then I'm fucking okay, right? And I'm happy with it, and that's what works for me. And I don't have to define my recovery the way that you define yours, and you don't have to define yours the way that I define mine, because we're all recovering from a lot of different things in life. I know I am. Well, I am, right? And part of recovery, like I could stop using alcohol and drugs. I still have a lot of fucked up characteristics that I need to change. I still have a lot of hurt and pain and stuff that I've been through that I need to heal and work on, regardless if I have drugs in my system or not. So for me, recovery is about healing and growth, right? And the drugs are just a part of that. And drugs are not bad. My relationship with drugs is the issue, right? My unhealthy relationship with certain drugs and certain points in time is the issue, not the drugs, because they didn't do shit. They're good, right? So that's kind of how I defined it for myself.
I love that, Chantel. Thank you. Before we had opened up, the Zoom room for everybody, Rachel had kind of, asked how do you respond when somebody, says, well, you're not in recovery. You can't do that and be in recovery. And, I started asking people, why are you threatened? Like, why does the way that I choose to take care of my wellness threaten you? Like, let's really talk about that. Why do we want to focus on what drugs I am or am not consuming, but nobody wants to talk about how this is the best that my mental health has been in years, right? That I haven't attempted to take my life in almost 11 years, that since getting access, to a stimulant like Adderall in combination with other things, that I haven't had any suicidal ideation in 11 months. And that's the longest period of time since I was 12. But instead, like, we're going to argue about, well, you can't call yourself in recovery because you drink or because you smoke weed or you do ketamine or whatever it is. And it's just, it's weird. Sorry, that was my little like kind of soapbox rant for this event. I'm one and done. You know, a lot of what Ceci and Chantel were talking about had me thinking about, there has been so much talk over the last few years about multiple pathways to recovery, right? There's been trainings. I mean, there's a whole conference that's hosted on that topic. So I'd love to know, you know, for all of you, like, what to you, like, what is missing from that conversation? Like, what are we not talking about when we talk about multiple pathways?
I think that we all know that it's a journey of sorts, right? Like any experience is going to be this feeling of a journey. But what I have really been disillusioned about this whole pathways conversation is that it still implies that there's a destination to that pathway, that the ultimate goal should still be this utopic, everyone is abstinent. And I think that that gets thrown in and kind of, you know, taints that conversation.
I agree. How about Nate or Joe?
Yeah, I would second that. You know, I think there's still, even, you know, even as more people, even as harm reduction, and I think I said this like a year or so ago, but harm reduction has become trendy now, you know, and so there's harm reduction light now. And I think that you know, people that are coming into this space for the first time, they have this ideology, you know, that the ultimate goal within this space is complete abstinence. And I don't think we're really looking at this from a space of reality. I think people are in like another realm when we look at this, because we really don't live in a society that makes it really that easy to be completely abstinent. Like, a lot of people working 2 and 3 jobs just to survive. Like, they're more than likely going to do drugs. I mean, that's just the reality of it, you know. It's expensive to live now. It's very, very expensive. And it, you know, and I just don't think that's applicable for most people. Maybe some people, but not a lot of people. And you know, Maya even talks about it in her book, Undoing Drugs, you know, about moderation and stuff like that, and how that's more applicable and feasible for the majority of people. And I, you know, and even for myself, there's been times where drugs have saved my life because I didn't kill myself. Like, I resumed use, and it kept me from literally taking my life. And so, and you know, I think people want to say they're all inclusive in this space, but they're really, really not. You know, I still to this day see most drug and alcohol counselors, like, their practice is based on their personal experience with recovery, and that's all they pitch.
Absolutely. I mean, wow, all of that is completely valid. Um, I think to, you know, then expand on that like a little bit, you know, further, what, you know, from what you guys see in your respective spaces, because you all, you know, Rachel with her, you know, experience, you know, being a nurse and having to go through, you know, getting her license reinstated. There's multiple, you know, people between myself and the panelists, and I'm sure, that, you know, have made different transitions throughout their recovery journey and didn't have a space to talk about that, didn't have people to talk to about that. I know when I made the decision to, you know, start using cannabis again and then to start drinking alcohol, I am so grateful that I had my best friend on that journey with me to talk to work through fears, concerns, you know, boundaries. What does it mean to have a healthy relationship with a substance? You know, what does it mean to not be, you know, terrified of drugs to the point where I choose, you know, to not use drugs or not utilize medication that would improve my quality of life. So, you know, I think for everybody on the panel, when, you know, those moments where your recovery was shifting, what was, you know, what was missing, or like, what did you have in that moment that made the transition easier, or what didn't you have that made that transition harder?
I think I can jump in on something on this. I think I was a little over 3 years into abstinence, practicing abstinence, doing 12-step. I was about 2018, and I went back to Massachusetts for one of my cousins had died by suicide, and I was back there, and it was like second or third time I had been back home with family where I had a very long-standing history of problematic relationship and access to substances, particularly cocaine, and then conjunction with alcohol. And most of my family was doing some form of medication around that, and it wasn't this desire to use because there was this trigger, there was this pull. I just really like the other tools that I had at that time, and I have a daily meditation practice that's been 8+ years, and I talk to people in recovery every day, and it just like really wasn't touching the emotional state, and I wanted a little bit of relief. And I realized with all that abstinence-based 12-step philosophy and stuff in my head that it's a big roll of the dice, you're putting everything on the line, you're going to lose all that time, like all these things I would hear. And I had some drinks, did some lines, and like the next day same thing again, but I stayed with my practices. And for me, a big thing was also realizing right there in that moment that this whole notion of disease, for me, disease is a whole word, not dis-ease in the human experience, was like, this is bogus. Like, this is not this whole demon drug myth that I'm going to touch it and all these things are going to happen. It's just a natural human tendency to want a little bit of relief. Like I think addiction in and of itself is just a little bit of a more extreme manifestation of the human experience at times. But what I realized too is that literally we hear like myself is talking about disordered learning, right? Like that trip home, and I came back and I didn't touch anything for a little while, but that was the shift in what my recovery looked like. Is, oh, this is actually like, I learned this as my best attempt at solving problems, and eventually was the only way I could organize my life was around obtaining substances all the time, and that I had officially unlearned my problematic relationship to substances in that sense. I mean, there's more to it in the sense where I'm like, I don't want to entertain too many ideas with opioids because I found that to be a little too attractive in a sense, but it is not the case for all substances for me. And so I think, the biggest part of it though was really all of those one-liners, all of those platitudes and things that had just so insidiously, subconsciously were always barking at me. And there was no encouragement to find that time and trust my gut that says, you know what, you are the expert in your own experience at this point. No sponsor, no person with any amount of time could tell you how to move through your day on a minute-to-minute basis. The time is just a manufactured construct that we've added a value to. And so for me, that moment of having a mindful awareness of being able to move through things and evaluate my relationship was more freedom than traditional recovery in any sense had ever offered me. And I'm not downplaying it, but that autonomy that was something that was restored, and I had no intention of recovering or ever finding that in the traditional sense. So yeah.
Absolutely. I know Rosie, I mentioned earlier, Rosie is my best friend. So we were able to take this, journey together these last couple of years, and, would just love to, hear kind of, what she, went through and, in her space.
Well, you were a huge part of that space. When I met Jordan in 2013, I didn't have 10 years, clean from, the abstinence model. When I decided to leave the 12-step fellowship that I was in, but I did have, I think that your environment has a lot to do with it, right? So I was going through like a really nasty divorce at that point in time. And I was really leaning on like my girlfriends to get through that. And in that time, I also had met somebody who almost had, a problem with substance use, but then, was able to pull himself out of it. And, now I just got married to him. Being around people that, support you with where you're at, and you have this environment that's supporting what your desire is. And at that point for me, it was, I want to be able to smoke weed recreationally. I do suffer from an anxiety disorder, and I do believe that the beginning of substance use is a lot of undiagnosed mental health issues, right? So when I decided to start doing that, I needed my girlfriends to also support me. And then in turn, Jordan and I both kind of went through that process right around the same time. I think we both got, you know, our medical marijuana cards like within like a month of each other, right? And then, as most of you know, like Jordan moved down to North Carolina about a year ago, and, you know, she's not, you know, a 10-minute drive away anymore. So even at that point, with, you know, reintroducing alcohol into my life and her reintroducing alcohol into her life, weekly FaceTime calls where we would check in. How are things going? Oh, well, you know, I think I'm learning, right? I can't sit there and say that, you know, I was able to, you know, I'm going to have 2 drinks tonight. Like there's been a few slip ups where it's like, I probably shouldn't have drank that much, right? But at the end of the day, you wake up the next day and you say, okay, we're not going to do that again today, right? So kind of like what Joe was saying, you kind of recondition your brain into, you know, it's not going to turn into a problematic behavior, because now we have that self-awareness to kind of pull back and self-reflect and say, I didn't really like where I was last night. Where do we pivot? What do we need to change? What was the environment that I was in? So, I mean, that's more or less my experience. But again, like I do have a lot to thank Jordan for, because I think that we really kind of held hands through it.
Like I said, having that connection, that support, is really, I mean, I think makes or break it. You know, Carla and I were talking earlier, getting ready, you know, for the event tonight. And, you know, she had a recent conversation with somebody that just couldn't really seem to grasp that, you know, there are people who can have healthy relationships with substances, or who can go from problematic use and be able to, you know, resolve it without formal intervention. You know, that spontaneous recovery, people do it all the time. And, you know, and I said, I was like, is it that they don't know anybody? Or that there's people in their life who are doing that, but don't feel comfortable telling them? Or are we just not even providing the space for people to explore what that even looks like? Yeah, Ceci, jump right in.
I mean, totally, I'm vibing with everything we're saying. I mean, I think for me, like about on the note about, you know, care and support, like I mean, I think we sometimes like lose the fact that like drugs are medicine, like not in like a kind of, ooh, drugs are medicine, but like drugs are literally medicine, you know, like they literally treat pain, like that's like why they're here. And I think sometimes it gets lost in like demon drug, just kind of like the whole kind of fantasy like our society has about what drugs are. Even though it's like in one moment, you know, if like someone will be in the hospital getting like fentanyl for a surgery, then we'll walk out and then see someone like smoking fent or something, and like not recognize that they're literally the same thing. And I think in a way for me, I think a reason that I don't know, I've never fully kind of felt, I don't know, like didn't really know where I fit in like a recovery kind of framework, was just I felt like it just focused too much on like the drug use itself. Because I think for me, I mean, I was using crystal meth and like fent like all day, every day, nonstop for a number of years. And even then it was never actually about the drugs themselves, you know? And for me, it's so much like about like literally everything else around me, you know, or like all of my other experiences and trauma, and kind of in a similar but like macro way to what like Rosie, you know, you were saying, that I mean, it is like, I know it's just, you know, set and setting, it's just so contingent on what's going on in your life. And drugs, you know, are tools, and they're literally medicine, and, you know, we use them to cope. And so, I mean, I think for me, what I found helpful and kind of from the thinkers that I, you know, have learned from, like, is, I don't know, it like, and I mean, Gabor Mate has the quote, like, why the pain, you know, is like kind of like the central question we should be thinking about, is like, why the pain? And I think, yeah, kind of like hyper scrutinizing, like, and I think also, you know, Jordan, what you've been saying about like, why are you threatened, or why do you even care what I'm doing, you know, to take care of myself? Like, it just really, it's like beyond like the whether you're using or not using is beyond, you know, the point of it all. It's about if you're doing okay, you know. And I think for me, like way the recovery for me, I think I could, I don't know, feel good with it is just, I think, kind of making clear, putting on the table like the object of it, of, recovery or any of these kind of frameworks, is about, yeah, I mean, again, also, Chantel, what you were saying about like healing. And I think a lot of times it's healing from everything except the drug use. I mean, a lot of times, at least, it can also be about the drug use, but it just seems so much more, than the drug use itself. And the issue is so much more about care and, yeah, healing.
I want to add something in too, is it's kind of more of just kind of a question, that like folks to consider is like, why is substance or chemical use like the only thing that we like hard charge abstinence with too? And I'm thinking about recovery is something inclusive, right? Like in the work that I do is we invite people in all forms of recovery, eating disorder and these things, but like disordered eating, work, problematic relationships to work, sex, shopping, all these other things you cannot fully abstain from and be human and survive. And yet this is the one thing, the one area we say, this is the only way to do it. And we're fine with everybody else having a understanding that a balanced relationship can arise out of all those other things. It is the only way to move forward, is periods of celibacy, maybe some dieting and these things, but this is the only area that I'm at least putting my fingers on right now that says this is the only proper way to do it, is you have to fully abstain. And yet then again, is everybody, again, is you go for healthcare and those things, every other person is med seeking, yet folks who use drugs are told they're med seeking in a very demoralizing, stigmatizing way. But again, the other panelists that said it's medicine too, is it's all these ways that it runs very contrary to the fact that like normal people are having experiences that run concurrent with the way that people use drugs seek out relief. And I think, really highlighting that it's time to raise awareness, these conversations, that balance in relationship to substances is just achievable and around the corner as it is for a balanced relationship with work, sex, food, etc. That's, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, listen, I have done damage to my savings account because I'm going emotionally shopping at Target or Marshall's. Like, Halloween decorations are out. I am purposely not going to Marshall's right now. And I need money to pay bills and live. So yeah, Nate.
Yeah, I'm gonna piggyback, but I feel like early on, especially within when I entered into the 12-step space, I think multiple panelists said this, but they tell you that the drugs are but a symptom. So if they're but a symptom, to me, that's an inclination that I can change my relationship with said drugs. And for me, it was a process, but I can remember early on people coming in and they would leave and they would resume use, and it would and I never seen them again. Their life was great. Like, it never became chaotic again. And for me, that was the first time I had really questioned, like, is what I'm being told the truth, or is there something here that I'm missing? And when I resumed use again, not this time, but my previous time, I think, the thing that I needed the most was just like people to talk to. And I noticed once I started becoming honest with resuming to use, my use actually declined a lot. And I was using more in moderation and being mindful of what I put into my body. And I think we don't talk about this enough, but a lot of times for me, my experiences, my relationship to drugs has changed as I've gotten older and I've grown up and matured a lot. And I understand, and it's naturally occurred for me in regards to how I use and don't use substances. And I also, I don't think we could say this enough, but a lot of the harms that is caused in a lot of these policies and these ideas about drugs are just based in pretty much around I forgot, Puritan ideology. I'm sorry, excuse me, Puritan ideology, that we all must be pure. And as their other panelist says, we don't use that modality with all these other issues that people have.
Yeah. No, I mean, I love this. I love this dialogue. It's got me all fired up. Yeah, Chantel, please jump in.
All right. So just thinking about, the whole conversation of having a community and what was that like switching for. So let's just, from myself, I'm going to be honest, right? I didn't leave 12-step recovery because of me not being abstinent anymore. I left because of the community, right? I left because of the racism, the transphobia, the homophobia, and stuff like that. So when I switched out and decided to leave that space, I didn't have a community of people to talk to, right? Because I separated myself away from recovery people, period. Because let's just be honest, it's not just the folks who are abstinent who have this type of mind state. It was in peer support groups, it was in harm reduction work groups that I attended. It was in every place. So I distanced myself away from recovery folks completely, right? And when I went through a challenging part of my return to use, I had no one. So I had to deal with that myself, right? And I had to find resources on my own. I had to talk to other folks who didn't never consider themselves to be a part of any recovery community on how to, do things, harm reduction and stuff like that. I learned my shit from the streets. This is being honest. I didn't get nothing from no organization. I didn't get nothing from sitting in no meeting. I didn't get nothing from these groups, right? The folks who were on the streets, the folks who use drugs, who taught me how to live and survive. Because the recovery folks, I could not be around, right? And coming into it in a space and time, I've been in this field for a while. I've done a lot of work. I've worked for organizations. I've done trainings. I've started organizations. None of that shit matters. Right? None of that shit matters at all, right? When you don't have a community, when you're struggling for connection, when you're struggling to just thrive and live, right? And so for me, my community was the folks on the streets, the folks who didn't have access to anything, who like, we'll show you how to do things where you don't overdose. We'll show you how to clean things. We show you how to we show you how to take care of yourself, because these other folks are not going to do it. They're going to say it. They're going to get all this funding and money to come and help folks who use drugs, but they're not going to go into where the folks who really need it, right? They're going to go outside the county into where we know where they're going. But so for me, I didn't have a community of folks who considered themselves in recovery. I found my community outside of that realm, and I still do to this day.
Thanks,
Wow.
Chantel. I'm really glad you brought all that up, because I think it's important to talk about, like, when we deem a certain topic as an outside issue, like talking about the very real and direct effects that has on people who are, seeking recovery or wellness or just services in general. And I think everybody on the panel has, experienced that in some, form or another. I can remember being told that it wasn't appropriate for me to talk about my medication issues, or to talk about, feeling suicidal. I just needed to just talk about the drugs, and feeling like I am seriously spending every ounce of energy I have today keeping myself from not walking down to the 8th Street Bridge and jumping off of it. But here I am again in this space and this community that I'm told to share is telling me, but don't talk about that. You need to tell your therapist that. Well, buddy, I'm on a 9-month waiting list for a therapist, but I'll see what I can do if I can hang in there. Or the people that would say, I know you're feeling down, but you didn't use today. And I'm like, I fucking wish I could. Right? Like Nate said, like, drugs absolutely at different points in my life are the reason that I am still alive today. It was a great question in the chat. What do you say to, advocates and people in recovery that are confused by people who are in recovery but aren't abstinent. Whoever on the panel wants to take that one first.
I mean, one of the things I think about too is history is super important to me, and so much of this, more than anything, it's been the thing that has changed my relationship to things, is having an accurate history. So first thing is I know in my experience where most of those questions stem from what's considered traditional fellowships and those things is, and I look at like the language piece is so important, because how many times is the term recovery actually used in the first 12-step book ever? It's like I think it's in there less than 3 times, the term recovery. And so in the AA big book, and so I focus a lot on like, where does anybody think they have a monopoly over what that means? It should be just as open for interpretation as any other language in anything, you know. And it was stuff like that in the rooms that drove me out of them. It was people that I had engagement with 1 day a week, passing all kinds of judgment and criticisms on my life that happens behind and outside of those doors 95% of the time. And I realized I think there's an unfortunate conditioning that exists that allows that to perpetuate, you know. But I do try to respond to folks. Well, like, let me ask you, what is the definition of recovery that you're looking at? What does recovery mean to you? Because I don't find recovery in the most traditional sense. I say I'm in recovery from an opioid use disorder because that's a relationship that I understand through contemporary, let's say, recovery, for the way that the term shows up in the community. But I also, like, I hear people say, oh, I got my life back. I'm like, I don't know, like, when my life was pretty chaotic, there's nothing I want to recoup from that time in my life. I want something different. I'm becoming, you know. So it's weird as I'm in 2 spaces on it. But I think it's, again, as I try to kind of turn around, as well, like, tell me what you think recovery means. And a lot of times is what I've gotten is it's so damn vague because it's stemming from some other regurgitated jargon out of a room. And I'm happy that that person's life is a lot better. But again, it's so robotic and homogenous in the sense that, like, there's not a lot of individual thought going on. And I'm like, I don't know, I feel like that's what I'm looking for. And so, those are some of the things that drove me out of the room. And I'm glad that it's still helping other people lead a different life. But again, it's like need that allyship that's possible coming from those folks. But again, it's engaging in some of that difficult discourse that I really don't want to, because it's my business and I've been harmed by those rooms, and finding common ground with a couple folks that, let's look at the language first and let's just see where that changes their understanding. I've had people pull that question back and be like, maybe, that's none of my business. That hasn't been the overarching theme, but there's been some groundbreaking success in a couple of areas with it.
For sure. Sorry, my brain just went completely blank.
Jordan, can I jump in? Am I allowed?
Yes, Carla, please, while my brain goes back to working.
So I'm loving this dialogue. As we just left Recovery Month, and I've had a lot of really interesting conversations. And one conversation that I had last week was with somebody, a very long-time advocate who has done great work in Pennsylvania in the recovery space for a very long time, 30 years. And they had said, well, I think that people are confused and we're scared that they might go and use if they listen to somebody who maybe had some time abstinent, maybe then chooses to then drink alcohol, and we're scared that they'll be confused and won't enter into treatment. And my mind was perplexed because, like, I had to really take apart that sentence and saying, what are you really saying, right? And I had said, well, what exactly what are folks confused about? What are folks confused about? Please break this down for me. And then what I really appreciated about the person was that they were willing to be vulnerable, and they had said, I'm confused and I'm concerned because I think that maybe I'm going to drink and I don't want to drink because I'm different than you. And if I drank, to drink is to die. Right. And I was like, I hear you. I thought the same thing, right? And so like we had to sit there and have like this very intimate, vulnerable, deep conversation, which I very much appreciated. The problem is that these personal views, right, of people that have been in these spaces for a very long time who have done amazing work, right? You know, with one modality in their mind, you know, is the one that's engaging with legislators. They're the ones that's engaging at the federal level, at the state level. You know, we're in 2023, right? And one of the other things that they had said was, well, I think that maybe like we need to find a different word than recovery. Like maybe like you guys should go find like your own language. And I was like, huh. And I'm curious, with that being said, what does everybody think about that? I was blown away, by the way, just so you know.
No, that's actually a really great question.
I mean, for me personally, I don't think we need to define recovery. I don't think recovery needs to have a definition. I mean, because like if we say that there's multiple pathways to recovery, that everyone has their own path, everyone's recovery looks different, they get to choose that, then why the hell are we trying to define it? There's no way to define it. There's no way to define it. So what's the point of trying to have a definition of what recovery is, right? I look at it as it being pointless, right? It's egos. This side wanting their way to be right and this side wanting their way to be right. So everyone's clashing on what's the right way to describe it, where there's no right way to describe it, because if it's individualized, then there's no true definition to it. It's different for every single person. Fuck a definition, just let people live. That's what I say.
Amen. I think Chantal just ate that whole question. I think what I've seen kind of in general, it feels like anything within our society is anytime something exists on a spectrum, people really seem to struggle with being able to understand and, you know, conceptualize what that spectrum like means, because, you know, it's easy when there's very neat, you know, rows and, you know, definitions to align people to. But if we're saying that you can swing back and forth at any given time in any which way, like it's a hard time like understanding, well, then how do we meet those needs? How do we treat that person? Yeah, Ceci.
Yeah, I think similar maybe to Chantel, what you were saying. I mean, like language is always going to fail us. And I mean, I think across all movements, I think in the harm reduction movement, especially, I mean, you know, like we're always kind of like fumbling for language to somehow kind of communicate with each other, you know? And I think what ends up though being like, I'm personally like not like I'm fine with setting a definition, you know, of something. And I do think sometimes it can be helpful to just be like, let's like for a moment just to like take, you know, recovery to mean X. So at least we have like some common, you know, some kind of common term. But I think like the issue where the issue stems from, which I think we're all thinking, you know, is, or what I've seen is I think when we start using like these words that we've kind of found as like the new language, you know, for example, like put like people who use drugs, you know, versus addict, or, you know, all the like kind of stigmatizing language that we're pushing back against, or even I think especially like substance use disorder, it's become this term that I think it's like, I don't know, like taken so for granted in a way that it's just kind of, and when it's left kind of, I don't know, like I feel like certain terms where we're hoping to change the meaning of what we're trying to get away from, that old meaning ends up kind of swooping back in. Like I think with substance use disorder, it really is just like the same moralistic kind of brain disease theory, you know, that addiction or drug abuse was talking about, you know, but in some nice language. And I think for me, what's more important than, you know, I think it's important to like kind of have some clarity in a vocabulary, but I think it's more, I think just like a focus on really kind of interrogating the meaning and kind of shifting how we're thinking about things. And I think like about this question of like, can you be in recovery if you're using drugs, or can you not be in recovery, you know, is besides the point, you know. I think like recovery as like a framework is like, there are so many assumptions built into it, you know, like for example, that drug use itself is even the problem, you know. And so I think if we get too invested in certain words and just kind of like, you know, get too caught up in these little things, we end up missing kind of the broader struggle around like what, you know, how we can actually change how we think and how we can generally change how we're approaching all these issues, so, you know, people stop dying because of it.
So I hear you, and I'm with you on that, right? And in the great state of Pennsylvania, as I've traveled this state and started to have some of these conversations, right? The truth is that just like myself many years ago, I thought one way thinking, and really, you know, let's keep it real. Before there wasn't all these different languages and changes and or treatment models, right? There wasn't smart recovery or spiritual based recovery, or it was never okay to say I'm a drug user in recovery, right? And in most places it's not, by the way. So my question is, I guess, to all the panelists is, and from the chat, I'm seeing that most people are experiencing the same things in their own hometowns, is how do we move people away by this one track, one framed mind of thinking of this is the way only, right? More into, and I hate using more buzzwords, evidence-based practices, right? Or like whatever the case may be. Like, how do we start these beginner conversations and saying like, look, here's the research, and guess what, right? Or maybe that approach isn't so well. Like, how are folks having these conversations in more conservative areas that like people aren't so educated, more far along? And that's my last question, Jordan, I promise.
No, you're
Sorry.
good. And I'll add a second piece to that question for the panelists to consider. You know, for those of you working in the space in a, you know, professional capacity, so like Rosie as a therapist, you know, Rachel as an addiction specialist nurse, like how are you also incorporating that into, you know, your interaction with the people that you serve as well?
For me, this is a really difficult space to navigate. I struggle to have those conversations, but I also don't shy away from them when they come up. I think a lot of what I do is just living authentically. Initially, when I started drinking, I felt like, you know, hide it from social media. Don't let people see. There's also this fear of like the state board coming back to get me, being like, you're not really doing what you're supposed to do. And so like I there's just all of these the fears of perceptions and the consequences of those people finding out. And over time, I didn't like how that felt, right? Like I was hiding this other part of me that felt like old behaviors to me. And so being able to live more authentically and just say, you know what, screw it. If you're not my kind of person, then you're not my kind of person. That worked for me personally, but like bringing it into the professional spaces is really difficult, especially because of what I have at stake, and what I'm still continuing to try to build. You know, like my job is important to me, but it's also how I sustain my family. It's also how I insure my family. And so there's just a lot to navigate there. And so I'm very cautious, but I'm grateful I work on a team where we are able to have open conversations. My colleague, who is a licensed clinical social worker, is also someone who is outwardly public about her journey with substance use, abstinence-based recovery, and what that looks like for her now and how that's changed. And so I'm grateful to have that community right there at work, where, you know, people see me every day, but it's not as easy to navigate those conversations, even when you get into, you know, people who were told, you know, a certain way. It's really hard to change those minds. And So I'm slowly like, I think I look at it as like infiltration from the inside, and I'm like slowly sprinkling these little like push your boundary ideas in, you know, patient facing materials, provider facing materials, big emphasis on the provider facing materials, because I will be the last person to stand up here and tell you that like nurses are so great with the stigma, because they're not. They're one of the worst, and they're the ones with the most patient face time in an inpatient setting, at least, and physicians and advanced practice providers in an outpatient setting, right? Like this is just incredibly problematic. So I am part of kind of the way I'm getting into that right now is trying to change the professionals' minds, because I think that that will slowly trickle out and have this ripple effect. But I find it incredibly challenging.
To
Yeah,
piggyback off of Rachel too, it's I agree with you entirely with like my own experience. Like I remember, you know, hiding it from social media and like being afraid to tell people, and again, like feeling like, you know, I'm hiding something. So bringing that into the professional world, like I remember working in like drug and alcohol treatment as like a technician even, and you see all too often that there's drug and alcohol counselors, and in Pennsylvania we have, you know, DDAP. They're preaching 12-step abstinence model and not disclosing any other avenues that they have to offer, just because that's their experience. You know, they have 10 years in a 12-step fellowship. So as I was like finishing up my internship and stuff, like I was very cognizant to not be that therapist for my clients. And, you know, like one of the social work values is meeting the client where they're at. So, you know, for example, you know, you have clients that come in and, you know, you can suggest, you know, there's this avenue, there's this avenue, there's this avenue. If they're completely opposed to, you know, abstinence model, and they say that's bullshit, I mean, I'm not going to sit there and, you know, argue it. And if you, again, like I said before, you read all this research and like, it's not a very high success rate when you do bring abstinence into the dialogue. So it is like a slippery slope though, even with the clients, because, you know, you're trying to kind of guide them and, you know, you're in the passenger seat, they're driving the car. I think that us with our own mindfulness, we need to, I know for myself, I still need to check myself. I still need to be very intentional with what I'm doing. And, you know, I don't know if this way works for everybody. And it's also not my job to make that distinction for somebody else. So, yeah, bringing it into the professional world, especially when there's other therapists and LPCs and LCSWs that still preach abstinence model, knowing that it's a DDAP violation, it's really slippery.
For
I wanna
sure.
add
Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
deep-
Sorry.
Oh yeah. This is, you know, and this is something I still sit with that's like very, very difficult for me, because I'm somebody, I accessed recovery through criminal legal intervention and drug diversion court. And I'll be the first to say that for the first 3 years I was in that program, I thought everybody needed a drug diversion court, you know, and won't get into the layers of privilege in my identity and experience that I started to see, like, this is set up for somebody like me, right? For a variety of reasons. But like, I was transitioning what recovery looked like for me during the time that I was working there. I spent 1.5 years working at that drug court program here in King County, where I was not completely abstinent. And I've been in other positions since then where the framework that the peers, that the people that I'm serving when I was at that more of a peer ground level, you know, like being in drug court, there's understanding the framework that the people that I'm working with are operating in. Like, and I do not like this, is it's considered, oh, it's a voluntary program, because you're either choosing to do this or go to prison, right? And so like not a lot of empowerment there, but I understand like part of this is acknowledging again and seeing the oppressive systems that people are participating in. And I had to weigh, as I was being transparent with friends and community and other people around me, that I was using is there's nothing in that disclosure of me using that was going to be, that I felt was going to be helpful in a lot of the situations I was in with the peers, the program participants, many of whom were people that I used in the streets with, because for them to use and to provide a positive UA likely meant probably going to lead to a period of incarceration. So I'm looking at, you know, the harm that is available to them in that program by me being transparent about it too, which was very difficult, is realizing like, I want to be open with this. And the reality is I couldn't see a lot of value at that time to being transparent with folks about it, because meeting them where they were at that time is acknowledging what was going to happen to them by trying to aspire to whatever I was doing in recovery. And I still wrestle with that to this day, because I was fighting against changing the language in the program and being more inclusive of other recovery fellowships, practices, different medications were coming on board. And I think, there's still a lot of those spaces too, where, it's really wanting to offer and make something available for people to see a bigger picture. And also at the same time as that version of meeting people where they are, I turn it over in my head so many different ways. Is that was the best I could do at that time. And I think it maybe was providing more safety to the folks around me. Tried to move that needle in a different direction and I couldn't. So, that's the biggest challenge I've experienced about not being able to be totally transparent in places and wanting to, because it wasn't going to serve folks ideally. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, we had a great question in the chat of, is recovery a part of harm reduction, or is it harm reduction and recovery? But I think everybody on the panel in some form, is involved or, has been involved in, direct harm reduction work. So would love to hear, thoughts. Like, is there an or?
I don't think there is a separation. For me personally, it's all recovery, right? If that's how you define yourself, right? Because we're not talking about our own personal recovery journeys here when we talk about doing harm reduction work and advocacy work, right? We're talking about a professional career. So our own personal recovery doesn't even fucking matter in this space, right? So if we're talking about recovery and harm reduction in that aspect of providing care and support for folks, we are supposed to provide care to folks, help folks stay alive, do ethical work, and to get the help that they need to be better. It says nothing about forcing anyone to be abstinent or following recovery a certain type of way, especially if you're a peer support individual. Our code of conduct is that person defines what recovery means to them, and we support them on that journey, right? I think there's no different. It's loving and caring for someone. That's all it is.
Jordan, I just wanted to say from the chat, Devin from Wilkes Recovery Revolution just wrote, for anybody that can't see this, it should not be separate. And that's why our syringe exchange is in the middle of our recovery center.
I think for maybe like a very specific reason, I think about them as different, not in any kind of antagonistic sense, or any I don't know, and for any reason other than I think harm reduction potentially reaches more people in the literal sense that I think recovery is specifically people who've struggled, or struggling with their use. Whereas I think, people, harm reduction, I think is a framework, for people, even if they're not struggling for their use. I think because recovery as a framework doesn't quite make sense, for people, who are, sorry, I'm getting a call right now, are like doing lines of K or something like every couple, weekends or something. So I think that distinction is just helpful, and I think it collapsing them into one category under recovery, I think misses that nuance. I don't even know if it's a nuance, but and I think it then ends up risking the idea that anyone who's using drugs is necessarily has a problem with their use or something like that. So I do think that distinction is helpful, but not for any kind of rivalry or antagonism.
I think that recovery can happen as a part of harm reduction. I don't want to say there's an or. I think it can be all inclusive. I just think it's important that we put no definitive term or like the end goal is recovery. Like we're pushing people down this narrow corridor. Like it's okay, but you have to, the ultimate goal is complete abstinence. I feel as if the first training I did was on ethics. I can remember ethics training and the principle of autonomy. And I just feel like people just don't honor that. I'm sure some practitioners do, but I just don't feel like that's a goal. But I feel like recovery happens as a part of harm reduction. And I didn't answer on the first question, but I think recovery to me is any positive change for someone, no matter what that looks like. If someone goes from shooting to smoking, that's a positive change in their life. They're going to have a positive health benefit from that transition. So I think recovery definitely happens within the harm reduction space.
I agree. For me, I can't separate the two because I use harm reduction when I use substances, right? I really subscribe to the whole drug setting. What am I going to consume? How am I going to consume it? What is my mindset? Am I using this to cope in some way? Am I using this to let loose? What is my intention? And in what setting? I know myself that in particular settings, I struggle to moderate with alcohol. However, I never felt like I aligned when I went to a 12-step meeting and people would say, oh, I never understood how people could set down a drink and it's still half full and walk away from it. That's bizarre to me. I do that all the time. And so it was just quite puzzling for me to try to like put those two things together. And so I use harm reduction every single day. This is going from cigarettes to vaping. This is, deciding I'm going to have a meal before I go out with some friends. It's choosing a lower alcohol percentage rather than taking shots one after another on an empty stomach, right? Like, so I'm using harm reduction and I identify as in recovery. And so I can't separate those two because I'm doing this every day in my life.
No, I think I agree. And I think these are all really great points. I think for me, one of the things I think a lot of people miss is, when we talk about harm reduction isn't just about somebody's drug use. It's minimizing harms, whether it has to do with their mental health. There are certain part of the reason why I needed to get on a stimulant like Adderall and to add, cannabis to the drugs that I use was because it is, to be honest, it's the most effective tool I have that keeps me from engaging in self-harm. And so it's, how are we addressing people's mental health? How are we addressing their physical health? How are we addressing those community needs? Like Chantel mentioned earlier, when she needed it the most, she didn't have a community and she wasn't able to, rely on the community that everybody was directing her towards. And there was another question that came through the chat that kind of fits in with that one. There seems to be a lot of, anytime somebody speaks out negatively, whether it's, on 12-step pathways or a specific modality of treatment, there's always people who get automatically defensive. So for example, if I say that like we have a serious issue with the quality of treatment in the US, immediately somebody will come in my comments, well, I work at such and such place and we're great. And my first thought is, well, then I wasn't talking about you. So why was there a need to come on and defend something? And I think, a part of having these very specific and direct dialogues is acknowledging that, it's possible to recognize where things have improved while also recognizing and addressing the issues that still remain. At a period in my life, 12-step recovery absolutely saved my life. But when I needed that same community to support me as I transitioned in my recovery and they didn't, that, took me 10 steps back. Instead of just being able to move with people as they evolve, right? As we work on our wellness. Recognizing that recovery is more than a support group setting, that family is a path of recovery. Family plays a central role in so many cultures, community, civic engagement. And so, when we talk about pathways, are we really looking at everything that possibly encompasses? Or because I'll hear people say, oh yeah, there's multiple pathways, there's AA, NA, smart recovery, MARA meetings, and yes, right, they're all support groups and they're all fabulous, but what about people who don't want a support group setting? Or people that, their family is everything that their life revolves around. How are we helping them explore that pathway? So I think I'd love to kind of like wrap up really, with that question of just, one, like, how do we really engage in these conversations that can get uncomfortable, but also acknowledge that if we don't start talking about the issues, nothing is ever going to change, and people just have to be willing to get uncomfortable and be bothered.
I'll go. I think a lot of it within these certain communities is a lot of pride and ego, and I think people have a hard time accepting that what they've always known isn't exactly what it appears to be to them, and I think they take it personal. And even I've even seen like people that are there could be people body brokering or doing scammy things, but all in the sense that they're doing quote unquote good work. People still think that that's okay, right? And a lot of people are just protective over what they've always known. And another thing is people fear what they do not understand. And I think that I think for one is that people that have found a different pathway, I think it's those of us that have became open, we need to talk about that and address that, but also we need to spearhead making safe places for people, whether that's drug users unions, harm reduction, recovery, whatever that looks like, and working together to find those places and make that stuff happen for these communities. I also think our approach is very important. I think if we're super aggressive, and I can be super, super aggressive myself and just be a complete asshole when it comes to this because I get so mad on this topic. But I think our approach and giving grace and understanding to the best of our ability is imperative, because if we come aggressive, no one's going to hear us, nor will they listen. And I think also coming with the evidence, for example, most of the time when it comes to Adderall, people think that with Adderall, it drives addictions amongst young teens and kids. And that's actually the opposite of what the evidence states, and things of that nature. And I could go on. I'm going to stop with that so other people can share.
Thanks, Nate.
Hey, Jordan, I'm late to the party, but can I just say one thing?
Yeah. Hey, Tom.
Hi, everybody. In my limited time in this space, I've only been a disciple and a facilitator for smart recovery. And one of the things that happens in every meeting is somebody comes into that meeting and bashes AA. And that's something we don't let happen. So that colors my view of multiple pathways, because that's what we preach in smart recovery. We do not preach abstinence, because abstinence, if you look at the continuum of the steps in smart recovery, that might be 2 to 3 steps into your quote program. So like somebody came into the meeting the other day and said, I'm not sober, can I be in your meeting? Hell yeah, that's great. The other part is you opened up the door of co-occurrence. I think that is the untapped mine of what's really happening out there, because I know we've talked a lot about recovery from alcohol and drugs. So I recovered from that way long ago. I didn't recover from the things that are bothering me, like adult ADHD and RSD until I accepted that as what I really needed to work on. So that broad definition has to start to include that. And the only other thing was, I learned from you guys' presentation at Mobilize is when you're in doubt with somebody, ask them how they identify. Ask that question. You may be uncomfortable asking that, but they're going to be comfortable answering that.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it. So I want to just go back and give, the other panelists a chance to, kind of provide, their thoughts on that wrap up question.
Can you state it again one more time, Jordan, please?
Yeah, shit, I knew you were going to do that. Nate, help me out here. You were the last one to answer.
So yeah, the question essentially was, how do people feel within, I guess, when we challenge the complete abstinence modality, how do we address that issue? And what have you faced, I think, when addressing
Oh yes,
issues?
thank you. I mean, so pretty much, these are uncomfortable conversations that need to happen, and so often we don't want to dive into that conflict. But if we don't start talking about the issues, nothing's going to change. So, for like that kind of wrap up thought, like, where do we go from here?
All right, I'll try to keep this kind of brief. I was looking at something along those lines earlier. Is I guess, again, as it kind of goes back, I look at, a lot of the social movements and uprisings the last couple of years as I have come into different understandings around race and understanding different things where it's like this idea that declaring a war on white supremacy is like declaring war on America. Well, yeah, it is, because it's the fabric of what we're swimming in. And I feel like if you look at the history of abstinence-based recovery, it is it's the water that we've been swimming in since, like it was a progressive approach to things in the 30s and that, but it's hard to decouple the fact that this is the air we breathe, the water we're swimming in. And it's like, it's been all encompassing. Nobody knows anything else, I think. I feel like that's the indoctrination that the pushback, the people that want to keep the status quo, that's what they're operating from. So I actually kind of have to see it as, it is the conditioning. And again, and this is, I'm somebody who's, I consider myself Dharma practitioner, like trying to meet intolerance with any further intolerance doesn't make me any better than that person. And that's a really hard space to be in, is like not, wanting to engage, but being so frustrated with things. But I know that digging my heels in and not being able to level with people. And so I think it really is it's getting down to understanding the place that people are operating from. Geographically speaking, the experiences that they've had. I've been fortunate to travel the country and travel the world in the military. It was a little bit easier to get the dust out of my eyes, but it still took a really long time. And so, I mean, this is, my closing thought on it is the encouragement that we want the compassion, and meet people where they're at. For folks like me, people who use drugs and those things, is I realize how often and how easy it is to get away from being willing to meet other people who aren't on the same line of thinking as me, where they're at. And that's a practice. And I can't do that every day. I don't have the bandwidth. And I'm a cis hetero white guy. I have more privilege and bandwidth than a lot of people to do that. And I have to safeguard my mental health on it. And so, it's the space and the time to be able to have the courageous conversations and meet those folks where they're at too. That's what I found has gotten me the best results in this. And that is not something I'm always up for 100% of the time because of the oppression that our community and our folks face. I can't show up for that work the way that I will show up for our people. So I've got my own work to do. Thanks, y'all.
Appreciate it, Joe. About any of the other panelists, any final thoughts with that question?
I'm not fully in this community. Like, as you know, I'm just kind of here, and I'm thankful to be here, and I'm thankful for all the, insight that I've gained tonight. So I'm not really up on like the words and the verbiage and stuff, but I think it's important to just kind of validate, like, at one point that, the 12-step fellowship had done something for me. And I still very much considered that first day walking into that first meeting a day that like really changed my life. Right. So like, giving that validation to that, not bad mouthing it, because it did serve a purpose and it did help me to get where I'm at today. And I'm very grateful for that. But then on the flip side, with that validation, hoping that there is care and compassion coming from the other person. And like I said, I'm not really up on the verbiage over here, but, you know, I think that it's just really important, like Joe said, to meet people where they're at and, you know, hope that they'll also meet you in return. I think it's also important that, you know, if you're a recovering people pleaser like me, saying what you mean and meaning what you say, and not saying it mean. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosie.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think about this in the aspect of of treatment, right? Again, if someone feels uncomfortable with someone saying that something is a problem or get defensive, that means that they're part of the problem. Something struck, something hit them, right? And instead of acknowledging it, a lot of times we get defensive, right? Because no one wants to be told that they're doing something wrong or that they're hurting someone. But the truth is, we're never going to grow or get to a better place unless we talk about the bad shit, right? We can talk about all the good shit all we want to, but the bad shit is not going anywhere. We have to start there, fixing that, right? And I think, you know, for me, we have to acknowledge when we're pushing abstinence-based recovery and 12-step recovery, the kind of lack of cultural humility that comes with pushing those type of environments, right? Because let's be honest, 12-step was built in the third tradition of AA, the long form. It says that no queers, no crackpot, no fallen women, and all these people are not allowed in their fellowship, right? So, but we're telling Black, brown folks, women identified folks, queer, trans folks that abstinence-based recovery and 12-step base is where to go, when that program was built not even for us to be included in it, right? I think before we can talk about stuff like that, before we talk about problems, we have to talk about the issues and where this stuff is rooted at. The is rooted in prejudice, is rooted in racism, is rooted in excluding women, is rooted in excluding queer and trans folks, right? We have to talk about that before we could talk about how to build this space, right? And the privilege of being abstinent based, right? The privilege that comes with being abstinence, right? Because you can go to a fancy treatment and detox. I have to detox at home. So I'm going to need something else to help me detox off of heroin in order to be able to get off of it, right? Which I had to do, right? Because those treatment facilities that y'all going through paying $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, someone like me is not getting into, right? And then the ones that I can get into are not set up for trans folks to be in. So I'm also being excluded from treatment because there's no place for me to go. So I think we need to sit and talk about those issues and problems and what the real problem is, right? And it's not being abstinent or not abstinent, it's the structure that's the issue and the problem.
Completely. Thank you, Chantel. Always coming in to just wrap everything up. Always want to be mindful of time. Again, I'm really appreciative of everybody being here tonight, especially our panelists. You know, we did record this. We'll send the link out. If you are not following us yet, follow us on all social media platforms at PA Harm Reduction. And this is just going to be the first of many events that we're going to do like this in the coming months. So I hope to see you all at future places. Stay real, stay radical, unconditional love, and I hope everybody has a great night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Night.
Bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone.
Great job.